Welcome to the Smarter Science of Slim, the scientifically proven program where you eat more and exercise less to burn fat and boost health.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hello, lovely listeners. This is Carrie Brown, and with me I have Mr. Jonathan Baylor.
What's up, Carrie? We're in the house in a studio which is not as hot as last time, but is still a little warm.
It is a little warm.
But warm enough to talk about, actually, I wanted to start, before we get on topic, God forbid we go off topic in one of these shows.
Never.
We started the show, and Carrie had asked me if I went to school at DePaul University, which is a school in Chicago, has a very good basketball team. People are probably pretty familiar with it. To which I answered, I did not. I went to DePaul University, which is in Greencastle, Indiana. But interestingly enough, I accidentally applied to DePaul University, intending to apply to DePaul University in the admissions office, because this was back in the day when I was playing football and I was going to play football for them. And they called me and they said, "We haven't received your application." And this is after all sorts of crazy. It was the last school I applied to. It was totally random. And I said, "Well, I sent in my application." And they said, "Well, we haven't gotten it, Mr. Baylor." And then I look at my application. This is before things were digital. And I had applied to DePaul University. And I was just like, wow, if they're on the fence about whether or not to let me in, the fact that I could not even apply to the right university, probably not a good sign.
That is so not you.
I know. I've tried to.
Random is not Baylor's middle name.
That was before SANEitize.
Ah, that's so what it was.
Brain was not functioning.
It was all those cupcakes you were eating, made you crazy.
So it was all those starchy carbs and calorie counting I was doing at that time. But I digress. Today, Carrie, we are going to talk about the first meal of the day. I want to have a show all about breakfast.
It is my favorite meal of the day.
You have a long history with breakfast because I think even prior to us meeting each other, you were quite famous for your fondness of breakfast.
So when I first started my blog, it was breakfasts. I started something, this is 4 years ago now, I started something called the Big Breakfast Adventure. And it was basically going to breakfast in every breakfast establishment in Seattle and writing restaurant reviews. And that earned me the coveted title of #2 food blog in Seattle. And I had a load of fun doing it for 2 years. And then I met you, and it all came to a screeching halt.
and I ruined everything. It all went away. But I do remember, Carrie, that you... and again, this wasn't just a passing fancy. When you were #2 food blogger in Seattle, it was a very cool thing you had going on. You still, you were blogging at the time. You had the same wonderful spirit that you bring to the SANE show now, which I love. And I remember distinctly when we first met, and I knew you more in the context of this breakfast food blogger, that one of the things you loved about breakfast was that everyone could enjoy a great breakfast, right? You could go to the fanciest breakfast spot in the world, and for less than $20, you could have the most fancy, amazing breakfast ever.
So there was several reasons why I chose breakfasts. One of them was selfishly because it's my favorite meal to eat out. I'm also a morning person, but the fact that a lot more people could afford to go out to eat if the meal was breakfast was a big driver in that, because it is, you can go out, you can eat breakfast, it's not expensive, and then you can get on with the rest of your day. Whereas if you do lunch or dinner, it tends to kind of mess the day up. And so there were lots of reasons, but the budget was definitely one of them.
Breakfast is such an important topic for us to cover, Carrie, because not only is it a meal which we can all very much enjoy, but it actually seems to be the meal which I think challenges people the most. Either so from an internet rumor perspective, right? There's two completely opposite things that have been talked about on the internet or in the media, whatever. One is breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Okay, that's on one end of the spectrum. The other is you shouldn't eat breakfast because fasting is good for you.
Right.
And they're literally the opposite thing. On top of that, so that's confusing. On top of that, usually folks, when they're waking up in the morning, they're busy, they have to get off to work, they have to get their kids ready, they're just trying to grab and go, they're trying to do something crazy. So breakfast, I hear more than anything, people say, how can I be sane during breakfast, and frankly, should I even eat breakfast? I heard it's the most important meal of the day. I heard that I shouldn't do it because I should fast. What's the deal with breakfast?
So just as an aside, I actually earlier this year, because I missed it so much, I reinvented the big breakfast adventure. So I am going back out for breakfast in Seattle, but this time it is completely sane. So my quest now is to prove to you all that it is perfectly possible to find a delicious, sane breakfast if you're eating out, because a lot of people struggle with how to eat out and stay sane. So I now do that with a focus on staying sane, going out for breakfast and doing that all over again. So that's just a little aside of what happened to that.
Carrie, I don't know if we're going to be able to squeeze this in because I've been taking so many notes about all the things we could talk about in terms of sane breakfast in this one show, but the first thing I want to cover specifically, now that we've hyped up breakfast, hopefully people are excited about breakfast.
Breakfast is awesome.
Breakfast is awesome. I want to give just a few facts about your biology and your brain when you wake up in the morning. And then from those facts, we can talk about, well, should I fast? Is breakfast the most important meal of the day? And what specifically should I eat for breakfast to maximize my sanity, to maximize my budget, to maximize my enjoyment, all that good stuff. How's that sound?
So you're going to do some geeking out in the science department.
A little bit light geek. This geek light. This is not going to be extreme geekiness.
But you're going to give us some science.
A little bit of science here. So wait, pause, quick interruption from our regularly scheduled show. Friends, it was really, really hot in the studio. I was getting too excited about talking about insulin, and what follows there is a big mistake. I made a mistake. It's not the first time. It certainly won't be the last time. And I repeatedly, in what follows, say that you are most insulin insensitive, which is just a terrible way to state anything with like triple, double negatives. So that's in the morning. That's wrong. You are most insulin sensitive in the morning. So you are most insulin sensitive in the morning. I mixed that up in what's about to follow. I got too excited and I apologize for that. But the good news is the point that we make in the few minutes that follow in the show still holds. And that is, forget about worrying about insulin sensitive, insulin insensitive, and the technical terms, yada, yada, yada. What really, really matters and what is correct about what Carrie and I talk about next is that insane, insulin spiking starches and sweets are uniquely bad for you in the morning. So regardless of my mistakes, the intention and the point of what Carrie and I are going to talk about next, which is that the worst time of day to consume insane starches and sweets, aka what conventional wisdom tells us to eat for breakfast, is in the morning. So again, my mistake, and I do apologize, is saying that we are most insulin insensitive in the morning. What I meant to say is we are most insulin sensitive in the morning, and the point still stands. Insanity is worst for you in the morning, right when you are told by the mainstream media to consume the most insane edible products. My apologies, and back to your regularly scheduled recording. The first bit of science to understand is that you've probably heard of the hormone insulin and how if we overdo it with insulin and we perpetually have high insulin levels, we get diabetes, we become obese, all sorts of bad things happen, right? It's not that the hormone insulin is bad any more than the hormone testosterone or estrogen are bad. It's that hormones with at improper levels for improper amounts of time are bad, right? So there's no such thing as a bad hormone. There are only bad levels of hormones. However, we are least insulin sensitive in the morning, which means that if we were to, the worst time of day to spike your insulin levels is in the morning, which is ironic because if you think about the most sugar and starcherific meal of the day, the most insulin spiking meal of the day, it is traditionally breakfast, right? Big glass of juice.
In America.
Yes, in America, which is, we should talk about that. So big glass of juice, cereal, toast, somehow that became a balanced breakfast, even though it's 90% carbs, 90% of those carbs are coming from garbage sources. You're spiking your insulin levels. That's not good. So what we can say factually is that to the extent that spiking insulin levels is bad for you, it is even worse to do that first thing in the morning because your body is least insulin sensitive. People who do things, for example, if you move around the internet a little bit, you might have heard about carb backloading or carb days, or people using carbohydrates in the fitness community to supercharge performance. These are usually done in the evening because your body is actually more sensitive to insulin in the evening. So if you were going to do an insulin spiking carbohydrate heavy meal, doing that later in the day, better than early in the day. This is also where some of the fasting stuff comes into play, because if you are not, let's say everyone is slightly insulin intolerant in the morning, the idea that you should fast or that you should eat really just fat, this is the whole butter in your coffee type thing, is because of this lack of insulin sensitivity in the morning.
Okay.
Make sense?
It's interesting you bring up the irony back there. I went on a big breakfast adventure on Sunday, and the girlfriend I was with, we were looking at the menu, and my comment was, in America, we truly are starch addicts, because 85% of the menu was starch. I mean, it was just, there was sane stuff we could eat, so I'm not saying there was nothing. But when you looked at the menu as a whole, it was staggering. It was just a starch fest.
And it just, sometimes it's sad, but it's funny. I don't know. It's all kinds of emotions where it's literally, you could not construct a more insane world if you tried than the world we live in. Because we now know bagel, bad. Bagel's bad for you. Not a good idea. But when would a bagel be worst for you? In the morning,
is when we typically eat it.
So it's not only are these foods, in quotation, horrible for us, but when we're told to eat them is actually the worst possible time we could ever eat them.
And I have to say, I interrupted you just now and said in America, because traditionally in Europe as opposed to England, they typically eat cold meats and cheeses, for breakfast. In England, we're kind of big on the cooked breakfast, the bacon and eggs. So it's not necessarily typical the world over. The starch thing is very American. And
it's also very modern, because even in America at the turn of the century, just before the packaged and processed food revolution, the only reason anyone's eaten the amount of sugar and starch and trans fats that we're eating is because we're not eating food, right? We're eating these processed products. Well, before processed products existed, people ate bacon and eggs for breakfast, right? That was the whole, and then in 1950s, Ansel Keys got up on his pedestal saying saturated fat kills you, which we now know it never did. But even so, this is very America specific, and it's very let's call it the obesity and diabetes generation specific. So what do we do? Instead? Well, first of all, I didn't actually answer, before we get into what you should be eating for breakfast, we kind of covered what you shouldn't be eating for breakfast. We still haven't put to rest should you be eating breakfast at all? AKA intermittent fasting, or should you definitely eat breakfast because it's the most important meal of the day, dichotomy of sorts.
And I couldn't survive until lunchtime. I mean, I just, the term hangry, which is hungry and angry. I would be hangry by, 9 o'clock. And sometimes when I go out on my adventures and I meet people, and some places just don't open for breakfast till 10. And I'm like, I have to have a pre-breakfast breakfast so that I'm not hangry by the time I turn up.
I think, hit the nail on the head there, Carrie, because anyone who ever asks me, should I eat breakfast or not? What do you think about fasting? This is a bit like saying, I mean, what do you think about, I can't think of a good example now, which is rare for me. I can't think of a good analogy, but it's a bit like saying, should I wear the color blue? Well, I don't know if you should wear the color blue. What context? I need a little bit more information than that. So breakfast is a function of you and your specific goals. So first and foremost, if not eating breakfast makes you feel like garbage, that's a good sign that you should be eating breakfast. So I would highly recommend you don't ever listen to anyone or anything that tells you to do something, which, one, there's science on both sides. There is science which suggests that not eating breakfast can have certain benefits. There's also science that suggests that eating breakfast has certain benefits. So the key thing is not, for me, it's not when you eat, it's what you eat. And I think I've said this before, and I'll continue to say this, which is you should eat when you're hungry and you should stop when you're full. If you're not hungry in the morning, I would not recommend artificially feeding yourself. Listen to your body. If you're very hungry, of course, you need to eat a SANE breakfast, and we'll talk about what those are in a moment. But there are some instances specifically when picking breakfast or not could be biased one way or the other. Let me give you some specific examples. If you are looking to maximize lean muscle tissue, generally speaking, you want to be triggering muscle protein synthesis versus muscle protein catabolism, which is when your body is essentially cannibalizing muscle tissue. Anabolism is when it's building muscle tissue. You want to trigger anabolism every 3 to 4 hours. And this is why bodybuilders traditionally eat every 3 to 4 hours. And they're not just eating a piece of bread every 3 to 4 hours. They're eating something with some protein in it because they want to trigger that muscle protein synthesis. If your goal is lean muscle tissue development or maintenance, when you wake up, you will have been catabolic for a long period of time because you haven't eaten anything. So if your goal is lean muscle tissue maintenance and or development, if that's your primary goal, then consuming a nutrient-dense source of protein in the morning is a good idea. Now, you should always pair nutrient-dense protein with non-starchy vegetables because if you don't, it's going to be very difficult to eat your non-starchy vegetable quota for the day. So for me, getting some form of nutrient-dense protein along with non-starchy vegetables in the morning, if your goal is around lean muscle tissue development or maintenance, is the way to go. Now, if you're just saying, look, I'm trying to burn as much fat as possible, I'm not hungry in the morning, should I eat breakfast? I would say there's a couple tricks you could do. So one, if you're not hungry, you shouldn't be eating in the first place. If you're not hungry, but you're like, oh, Jonathan on that podcast said that I should get some sort of protein in my body or else my muscle tissue is going to waste away and I want that to happen. We've talked about historically the amino acid leucine. Mm-hmm. So what you can do if you want is this is not clinical science. This is looking at the clinical studies and then extrapolating based upon them. So what you could do if you wanted to is get some branched chain amino acids. This is getting a little geeky, but get some branched chain amino acid powder or get a very pure form of protein that is very low in calories, such as a egg white powder, which is like 90% protein, right? So now you are going to take in as little energy as possible. If you're taking in branched chain amino acids, high dose of leucine with some other amino acids, you're taking in, 50 calories maybe. And if you're taking an egg white protein powder in a 20 or 30 grams worth of protein dose, again, that's going to be pure protein. So you're looking at sub 150 in terms of calories. So you're basically fasting, right? If you're taking in that few calories, you're basically fasting. And if they're all coming from protein, protein's not an energy source. So it's not like you're giving your body energy. You're giving your body pure structural component, if that makes sense. So personally, for me, what I would recommend is one, if you're hungry, you're eating a SANE breakfast. If you are not hungry, I personally think that for the vast majority of Americans, given that we live in a country where 70% of us are struggling with metabolic syndrome, are struggling with overweight, which suggests we're on our path to metabolic syndrome, that we should basically always be taking in at least a concentrated source of protein so that we can maintain our lean muscle tissue. And if we're going to do that, we might as well take in some non-starchy vegetables as well. So I'm going to vote on the side of, if you're hungry, definitely eat. If you're not hungry, you don't need to eat. But if you're not hungry and you're concerned about losing lean muscle tissue, or if you don't eat, you're not going to hit your non-starchy vegetable quota, then I would recommend doing the sort of hack type breakfast I just described.
Another problem I find is that if I don't eat breakfast, I can't actually eat enough food, because I wouldn't eat more food at lunch and dinner. So I'm actually like a third of my food intake will just go away. And because my appetite isn't very big, then over the course of the day, I'm simply not eating enough food.
And that's really the key thing. That, again, fasting, it works for some people. There are some benefits to it. If it works for you, I will never advise against it. But so this might sound a little bit silly, but we have Angela, my wife, and I have a new favorite restaurant. And it's a Afghan restaurant, which is just down the street from us. And recently we were heartbroken because the entire month of July, they were just inexplicably closed. Like, why is this restaurant closed? What's going on? And then we were like, oh, this isn't like what is that? Because there was no explanation. We were just like, we were like angry. And then we went in August and we noticed that they were open and we said, hey, what was the deal in July? Come on. And they're like, oh, it was Ramadan. And during Ramadan, an entire like sect of the world is fasting. They don't eat from sun up to sundown. And if I actually asked them, I said, so in Islamic culture, do you see widespread and rapid weight loss during Ramadan? And do you kind of just notice on the whole that Ramadan seems to make everyone happier and that it works really well from a health and fitness perspective? And first of all, they were just like, well, I've never thought about that. But it's just like if fasting was this miracle cure, there are cultures and religions which fast all the time and don't really talk about, well, I was struggling with my weight and was diabetic, but I'm not that way anymore because Ramadan happened. Right? So fasting has been purported as this new magical thing that is the cure-all to everything. Look, in the most cynical sense, fasting is a euphemism for starving. I mean, it's just not eating, right? I mean, people are hesitant to say just eat less, but they're really happy to say fast more. Fasting more is eating less,
Nothing.
Right? I mean, so that's not, if you are fasting as a euphemism to eat less, you shouldn't be doing it. If you're fasting because it makes you feel better, and then when you do eat, you're eating sane foods, I'm all for it. But please, let's not call starvation dieting something else and be like, yeah, that's great, let's all do it. At the focus has to be not on trying to trick your body into eating less garbage food. It has to be celebrating your body's ability to take in an abundance of sane food. So for me, skipping meals with no regard for the individual or their goals sounds a lot like the old school approach, not the modern science approach of abundance and sanity. So, but again, that's just me. So anyway.
And the other thing I think, and I'm guilty of this, is we forget that because we're asleep, we're not cognizant of the fact that we're fasting for 10, 12 hours. And we forget that. So if we then fast during the 12 hours that we're awake,
yep,
that kind of makes it seem a bit crazy thing to do. And
this is another just anecdotal example, but when I'm just trying to, like, I love to marry the science with common sense, because I think that's a good check, right? Because for a while there, the science, quote unquote, said saturated fat gives you heart disease, but no one said, hey, wait a minute. Like, we've been eating saturated fat for a really long time and actually have eaten more saturated fat historically, and we had lower incidences of heart disease. So it didn't pass the common sense test. So I've noticed very common in my parents' generation, especially among males. So both my father and my wife's father fit into this category where they just don't really eat during the day. They don't really eat breakfast. They don't really eat lunch. And then from 8 p.m. at night to 10 p.m. at night, they just eat freaking everything. I mean, it's just like a constant, just cheese and they just go to town. And they do that naturally. They've done that for years. And that hasn't yielded dramatic health benefits to them. So the only consistent pattern I've seen anecdotally that results in long-term health and happiness and slimness is not a function of when you eat. It is simply a function of what you eat. Like, it's that simple. Simplify. Don't make this any more complicated than it needs to be. Eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, and when you're hungry, eat sane foods. Don't let anyone distract you with anything else. What do you think?
Slim is simple.
So to close, Carrie, we've talked about, obviously, for all the people out there that have had success with intermittent fasting, again, we are not saying you're wrong. We're saying it's awesome that it's worked for you. And individuals out there, if you haven't tried intermittent fasting and it sounds interesting to you and you want to try it and you get great results, I 100% support you in doing that. If you're not doing that or you don't fall in that camp, don't feel bad, because an abundance of healthy food is good for you. So to that end, Carrie, let's close with your go-to options and my go-to options for a sane, satisfying breakfast for those who choose to eat a sane, satisfying breakfast.
So my work week varies from my weekends. So my work week, I have a smoothie, which is, and I typically now have my hardcore green smoothie, which is basically coconut milk and egg white and spinach.
Nice.
But there's a whole, up on my website, there's a whole bunch of recipes for my orange creamsicle and my strawberry milkshake, which just have some other things added to make them more delicious. But during the week, I find that the fastest, sanest way, and it's a brilliant way to get veggies in on the run. At the weekends, I tend to go the scramble omelette veggie route that I like. I enjoy, I love eating eggs, and I like to cook. Funny. And so that's what I do at the weekend. I focus on eggs, making a scramble or an omelette with a bunch of veggies in it. And, sometimes I'll add some meat, sausage, bacon, all of that good stuff.
Carrie, you and I are sharing the same sentiment here. I wrote down 4 categories of foods that I like to enjoy and like to recommend for a sane breakfast. And two of them are just what you mentioned. First, and then they're a function of how much time you have. So I'll start with, I have the least amount of time. So individual has the least amount of time, like you said, work week smoothie. Green smoothie is the way to go. Easy breezy, done. Do it the night before. Heck, do it on Sundays or Saturdays. Blend them up all for the week, or blend them up 4 days at a time. And Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, done. Wednesday night, blend some more. Thursday, Friday, done. Taken care of. When we've covered smoothie recipes and other shows. Second on the list in terms of time is your wonderful sane, non-starchy cereal options, because then you can pre-make the sane oatmeal, for lack of better terms. And again, recipes can be found on carriebrown.com, but you're looking at, instead of using something that's corn or flour based, you're looking at an almond meal or a coconut meal base, delicious cereal, just add a liquid, you're off to the races. You're probably going to need a green smoothie in addition to that, because you need your non-starchy vegetables, but that's that middle option. And if you have more time, eggs, non-starchy vegetables, nutrient-dense protein, easy breezy. And I love that too, Carrie, because that gives us there's all kinds of different textures in there. That's all kind of different flavors. We've got savory and fatty options. We've got more starchy options. We've got sweeter options. And then the fourth category, which I know Rob Wolf is a big fan of, people are like, how do I go paleo in the morning? You can just eat food that you would eat for breakfast and or for lunch and dinner in the morning. There is no, I promise you, I've tried this and I've been on the lookout. There are no breakfast police. That if you eat a lunch or dinner option at 8 a.m. in the morning, no one's going to yell at you. No one's going to scold you. So I know that the media and marketing likes to put things into categories for us so that they can sell us more things. My favorite example are men's and women's razors. What is the difference between a razor for a man and a razor for a woman?
I know.
What's that?
One's pink.
Exactly. So just like there's no difference between a blade used to cut hair on a woman's body and a blade used to cut hair on a man's body, time of day does not dictate whether or not something is sane or insane. It may make it more insane in the case of starch, but don't worry about eating a piece of salmon and some vegetables for breakfast or leftovers from the night before. That works too. That
just reminded me of my new favorite breakfast is from my Eat Smarter Soups cookbook, and it's my creamy onion soup. And it actually, I had some in the fridge and I was running out the door and I didn't have time to make my smoothie. So I grabbed my dish of onion soup and I took it to work. And what was brilliant about it was that the texture was so like oatmeal. It obviously the flavor wasn't, but it was warm and it had the texture. So I got the comfort of eating oatmeal, but all I was eating was vegetables. So that's my new favorite thing for breakfast.
It's brilliant, Carrie. And I'm happy that we can close on this note because it's more of a philosophical note, which is to the point of it doesn't have to be a quote unquote breakfast food for you to eat it for breakfast. If you really step back and think to yourself, why do I think that breakfast foods are breakfast foods? The reason is generally, they just are. Like that's the way it's always been, right? Eggs are a breakfast food. But if you find yourself thinking about something and the best reason you can come up with is either that's what I've always done or that's what I've always been told, that's a big red flag that this is an area of your life you might want to think more about. Because if you think about like any progress that has ever happened in humanity in general, it's always because someone challenged this idea that, oh, we've always done it that way, so we need to keep doing it in the future, right? That's not a good reason. So just because you've heard it or you've been taught it your whole life to think you need to keep doing it, not a good reason. Take a step back, think about, is it sane? Does it make you happy? And make that decision for yourself. And that was very philosophical and soapboxy, and bringing it down to a more concrete level, you'll get to eat a lot more different foods for breakfast. So there you go.
Right. And just to mention, if people are wondering where the protein is in my onion soup, what I do now is I'll take a dish of non-fat cottage cheese and I'll eat the cottage cheese and I'll have my soup. So I've got my veggies, I've got my protein. It's all goodness.
But cottage cheese isn't a breakfast food, Karen. I'm just kidding.
The other thing is in the dairy department, if you're a fan of dairy and you want protein in the morning, is our favorite friend, our non-fat Greek yogurt.
Yeah. But really, please just break down those artificial boundaries in your mind, because so much of this complexity isn't needed. And it's a function of there being these artificial rules. I mean, think about complexity comes from complicated rules. So you can only eat these foods for breakfast. You can only eat these foods for lunch. You can only eat these foods for dinner. What? Right? Unnecessary complexity. Simplify, go sane. What do you think?
I think it's awesome. That's just reminded me, talking about, what is typical for breakfast. When I was still living in England, one of my favorite things for breakfast is haddock, which is smoked fish.
Yep.
And kippers, completely normal thing to eat in England. So, I mean, it's not here, people fish for breakfast, but in England, that was one of my favorite things to do. And it was okay because that was our culture.
So we should try to start a new tradition, Carrie. So listeners, you got to hold us to this if we forget to do this. But I want to start closing every show with an action item. I want people to have an action item. So the action item for this week is you either need to take what you've been told is a breakfast food, that's sane, like eggs, and you need to eat it for dinner. I know, crazy. These are not going to be hard. They just have to be baby steps. And so it's two parts. And you have to take a food which is quote unquote not a breakfast food, but is sane, and you have to eat it for breakfast. And then
just try it.
Yeah. And then just see to yourself, oh, wow, look, I can do that. And then you might actually find that there are other areas in your life where you've been told you can or can't do things for your entire life, where if you just take a step back and say, I'm going to try something different, you open up all sorts of wonderful doors. So I think that's your assignment for this week, and I wish you good luck.
Happy breakfasting.
I love it, Carrie. This is wonderful. It is sane. And listeners, remember this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. And stay sane. We'll chat with you soon.
See ya.
Wait, don't stop listening yet.
You can get fabulous free SANE recipes over at carriebrown.com.
And don't forget your 100% free eating and exercise quick start program, as well as free, fun, daily tips delivered right into your inbox at baylorgroup.com. That's BAILOR group.com.